At the beginning of the movie, we are transported to 1960s Houston, Texas, where we meet young George Foreman, a skinny, wide-eyed kid moving into a rundown house with his family. And when I say rundown, I mean this place doesn't even have electricity yet. No lights, no comfort, just four walls and a whole lot of struggle. That first night, George's mother places a single hamburger on the table, one burger, split into 4 pieces for 4 hungry children. George stares at his quarter of a burger like it's the last meal on earth. He wants to devour it immediately, but his sister Mary insists they pray first. George reluctantly bows his head, waiting. The moment the prayer ends, he swallows his piece in one bite and immediately looks around the table still hungry. His sister Mary, without a second thought, slides half of her portion toward him. That moment right there tells you everything about who these two people are. Mary sees the best in George even when no one else does, and that dynamic is going to carry this entire story. That same night, George's mother sits him down with a warning that hits like a gut punch. She tells him he cannot afford to be held back another year in school. Life is already hard enough. She begs him stay out of trouble. Stop fighting. But the very next day at school, George walks into class, and the stares begin immediately. His clothes are worn and dirty, and when he tries to answer a question, the teacher brushes him off, literally calling on another student because of his shiny shoes while George stands there invisible. At lunch, George sits alone. No food, just watching everyone else eat. Then one of his classmates decides to taunt him, waving food in his face and treating him like a dog. George snaps. He throws a punch and runs before the teacher can catch him. George admits, anger was my answer to everything. And I couldn't stop myself from fighting. It was the only thing I did well. Few years later, George is a teenager, hanging around outside a bar with a friend. They spot a drunk man stumbling out, and they make a terrible decision. They decide to follow him and rob him. Here's the twist that almost destroys everything. The man is a police officer. It was a sting operation. The police swarm in. George runs for his life, dives under a house, and in one of the most desperate moments in the film covers himself in sewage to throw off the police dog tracking his scent. The dog passes right by him. He survives, but just barely. On his way home, something catches his eye through a store window, a TV displaying an advertisement for Job Corps, a government program offering vocational training to young people who've dropped out of school. Free food, free housing, a paycheck just for showing up and learning. George runs home and tells his mother. She listens carefully, then gives him one of the most powerful send-offs. She says, if you're going to do this, do it right. Don't come running back home because you're missing me. Finish what you start this time. Few days later, George arrives at the Job Corps facility in California. From day one, he's already clashing with another resident named Desmond over something as simple as a bed. These two are going to be oil and water at least for a while. George finds a pair of brand new Converse sneakers in his bag, left there by his mother along with a note. Desmond watches him with envy. George struggles in his electrical class, drawing laughter from everyone around him. He shoots back a hard stare, the kind that says, I've been through things you couldn't imagine. But inside, he's clearly out of his depth. Then the sneakers go missing. Someone stole them. Desmond, the same guy George nearly fought on day one, tells him to report it after they eat. And during that meal, something unexpected happens. These two start actually talking. Desmond, it turns out, is brilliant with numbers. He's figured out how to manipulate the cafeteria's weekly order sheets, replacing beans with brownies. He's running a small-time hustle right under the administration's nose. But George's focus snaps back when he spots someone across the cafeteria wearing his stolen sneakers. The guy notices George's glare, panics, and locks himself in his dorm room. George doesn't hesitate. He breaks the door down and nearly throws the thief out the window. That's when Doc walks in. Doc, whose full name is Charles "Doc" Broadus, breaks up the fight. He pulls George outside. George tries to justify his actions, explaining that his mother had worked hard to buy those sneakers. Then Doc lays out 2 options with zero drama: jail or go home. But then he pauses. He asks George something completely out of left field. Have you ever boxed? George says just street fights. Doc corrects him immediately. I'm talking about boxing. It's a sport. It has rules. Doc sees something in George that George himself doesn't see yet. He offers him one more chance, but this time, George has to join the boxing program. George says yes. The first day in the gym is humbling. George gets into the ring with a sparring partner who immediately starts cracking jokes. George, who has never learned to separate emotion from action, responds with aggression instead of technique. His opponent knocks him down in seconds. The crowd watching laughs. George walks out, finds a punching bag, and hits it so hard it crashes to the floor, silencing every single person in that room. Doc finds him in the locker room and delivers a truth that reframes the entire training process. He tells George that 6 months ago, the guy who just knocked him down was exactly where George is right now. The difference? That guy listened. He learned. George mentions about the laughter from the other guys, but Doc insists that he must ignore the opinions of others and focus on his training. Doc begins training George with absolute intensity footwork, coordination, strategy, positioning. George struggles with the technical side, and Doc keeps reminding him. Boxing is about strategic thinking, not just physical hitting. When George calls home to tell his mother about his progress, the conversation takes a turn. She asks what he's learning. He says boxing. Her voice drops. She doesn't want her son fighting. George tries to explain, "It's not fighting, Mom. It's a sport with rules." But the call cuts off before they can resolve it. He's run out of phone credit. But here's what happens next. George faces the same opponent who embarrassed him in front of everyone. This time, within seconds, George knocks him out cold. Doc stands there quietly impressed. George starts devouring boxing magazines. He walks into Doc's office and learns that Doc was once a professional boxer who won his first 24 fights. George shows him an article about Joe Frazier and announces that he intends to become the heavyweight champion of the world. Doc smiles, not mocking him, but genuinely moved by the audacity of this kid. He tells George to slow down. You can't rush greatness. In fact, Doc says George won't be ready for the Olympics for at least 5 more years. 5 years, George says. I'll be an old man. Even if you train harder than any man has ever trained, there is no way that you can make it to the Olympics next year. 1 year later, just 12 months after Doc said it would take 5. 19-year-old George Foreman steps into the ring at the 1968 Mexico City Olympics, facing a far more experienced Soviet boxer. Commentators don't give him a prayer. But George's family is glued to the television. His mother, who hates the violence, cannot look away. George dominates. He delivers punch after punch, winning the gold medal with an ease that stuns everyone watching, including the commentators who had written him off before the first bell. When George lifts the American flag in victory, the moment is electric. His siblings erupt. His mother sits in a complicated silence, proud but terrified, relieved but heartbroken about the violence she just watched her son endure. The next day, George walks through his old neighborhood wearing that gold medal-like armor. And that's when things get uncomfortable. A former associate approaches him and criticizes him for raising the American flag, contrasting it with the powerful protest made by other black athletes on the podium. He accuses George of disrespecting the movement. George doesn't have an answer in that moment. He goes home to his mother, exhausted and hurt, pouring out everything he's been carrying. She listens. She feeds him. She reminds him of who he is. And when George leaves that conversation, something has been decided deep inside him. He's going to win the belt. He's going to earn everyone's respect. At the airport, George spots a beautiful woman reading a sports magazine with his face on the cover. He approaches her confidently. Her name is Paula. She's sharp, quick-witted, and completely unimpressed by his attempt at a pickup line. When her flight is called, she tells him to write down his number. She'll decide if she calls. George is left standing there, slightly stunned. He say, "I am the one supposed to ask for your number. George, do I look like the kind of woman who that stands around by the phone?" He scribbles his number, and after she leaves he mutters to himself, "No, man, you do not." She calls. Under Doc's guidance, George assembles a professional team, including Dick Sadler as his promoter and the legendary Archie Moore as a trainer. He begins climbing through the heavyweight ranks. One by one, opponents fall. His record climbs to 22-0. Paula becomes his biggest supporter at ringside. They fall in love, and eventually, they get married. By his 36th victory, Doc announces George is ready. The title fight is set: George Foreman versus Joe Frazier in Kingston, Jamaica. Frazier had already defeated Muhammad Ali 2 years ago. Almost nobody believes George has a chance. But from the opening bell, George is a wrecking machine. When he knocks Frazier to the canvas with a thunderous uppercut at the end of the first round, the world starts paying attention. By the time the referee stops the fight after George has knocked Frazier down multiple times, the sports world is completely turned upside down. George Foreman is declared the new heavyweight champion of the world. But behind the scenes, cracks are already forming. At the after-party, George's eyes wander to a charming woman. He also approaches Desmond, offering him a role as his financial manager, acknowledging his knacks for numbers. Desmond agrees, promptly pouring out his drink as George insists he stops drinking. Later, he makes a decision that night that he immediately regrets. He's unfaithful to Paula. The guilt hits him the next morning like a left hook he never saw coming. Then he turns on the TV and sees Muhammad Ali in an interview, mocking him, promising to throw him back into the ghetto with one punch. George's blood begins to boil. The fight is set in Kinshasa, Zaire, what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, in one of the most legendary boxing events in history. And from the moment George arrives, he knows he's in enemy territory. Ali is a god in this country. The entire nation chants, "Ali, Bome, Ali, kill him." At the hotel, George sees Ali performing for a crowd of celebrities, doing a comedy routine mocking George. When George approaches, the crowd holds its breath, expecting a confrontation. But George simply walks away in silence, and that choice tells you how much he's still simmering inside. The fight begins, and George does what George does. He attacks. He lands significant punches. He drives Ollie to the ropes over and over. He unloads everything he has. But Ollie has a plan nobody expected. He lets George hit him, absorbing the shots against the ropes, making George punch himself out. Round after round, George throws everything he has. Ollie stays composed. He taunts George between punches. "That's all you got? They told me you was bad." By the 8th round, George is completely exhausted. His legs are gone. His punches have no power. Ollie, still fresh, still sharp, suddenly unleashes a combination, and George Foreman crashes to the canvas. For the first time in his professional career, George Foreman has lost. The defeat unravels everything. George realizes that he has been blinded by his aggressive nature. He decided to make amends. George calls Paula and promises to change to be the husband she deserves. But Paula has been carrying wounds of her own. She hands him divorce papers. George fires his entire team, blaming Dick and Archie for his loss. He visits his mother for comfort. Then, in an attempt to prove he's still George Foreman, he arranges one of the strangest events in boxing history: a fight against 5 opponents in a single day. Doc urges him to abandon this reckless idea before it's too late. Everyone thinks he's lost his mind. Even Muhammad Ali shows up as a commentator, cracking jokes at George's expense. But George completes it. He knocks out 3 of the 5. He demands a rematch with Ali. Ali brushes it off with another joke. Then everything stops. George gets word that his pregnant sister Mary has been rushed to the hospital. She's bleeding, and the baby's life is in danger. George races to the hospital and pours everything he has into a moment of pure desperation. He steps outside alone and prays not the reluctant, impatient prayers of his childhood, but a raw, broken conversation with God. He tells God to take his life if a life must be taken. Just spare Mary's baby. The next morning, the doctors have no medical explanation for what happened. Mary's baby is alive and perfectly healthy. George is shaken to his core. In a subsequent fight against Jimmy Young, George loses by unanimous decision. In the dressing room afterward, he collapses heat stroke, and in that unconscious state, something happens to George Foreman that he will spend the rest of his life trying to explain. He wakes up and says 4 words that silence everyone in the room. "Jesus Christ is alive in me." Doc stares at him like he's lost it. But George is completely serious. He gets baptized. He starts preaching at a local church, nervously at first, stumbling over his words. But when he spots a young woman in the congregation listening intently, something settles inside him. He finds his voice. Doc is skeptical of George's sudden change, suspecting it might be for show, and feels deeply upset about his decision. George goes to Ollie and asks for forgiveness. Ollie, true to form, can't resist a joke, assumes George wants a rematch. But when George makes clear this is genuine, something shifts between them. 2 former rivals begin the process of becoming real friends. George visits his ex-wife and his children. He apologizes. He means it. He meets a woman named Mary, the same name as his beloved sister, and they begin building something real together. He finds an old abandoned church and shares his vision of buying it and turning it into a congregation. He's completely transformed. 7 years pass, and that dream becomes reality. Then one day, a woman walks into his church asking George to train her grandson. The boy is heading down a dangerous path. George declines, tells her to find guidance in the Bible. A week later, the boy is arrested for a serious crime on the news. The guilt of that moment sends George back to the one place he swore he'd left behind. He discovers a building perfect for a youth center, a gym where troubled kids can come and find direction. He tells Desmond, now his financial manager, to make it happen. They renovate it. Within months, the gym is thriving. George even names a section of it the Muhammad Ali Study Hall. But then the lights go out. The power company comes knocking. No payments have been made. George calls the bank and gets news that shakes him to his foundation. Desmond has invested every dollar of George's money into high-risk stocks that have completely collapsed. The bank is threatening to repossess everything, including his mother's house. George finds Desmond hiding in a bar. He comes terrifyingly close to unleashing the old George Foreman on him. But in that moment, he stops himself. He forgives him. But the damage is done. The bills keep coming. George does sauce commercials. He sells merchandise. His wife Mary sits him down and says the numbers still don't work. They're going to lose everything. George goes to his old gym bag, pulls out his gloves, and makes a decision that makes absolutely no logical sense to anyone on earth. He wants to fight again. He's 40 years old. George goes to find document. Doc pushes back immediately, reminding him of what happened to Joe Louis when he tried to come back. They almost killed him in the ring. George counters with the same words Doc once used on him. The air's going to taste different. The sun's going to look different. Only 2 men on earth are going to matter. Doc's eyes light up. Training begins, and it is brutal to watch. George has to lose massive amounts of weight just to qualify. He struggles through every workout. His son trains alongside him, pleading with him to slow down. His wife quietly starts helping him stick to his diet. Slowly, painfully, George makes weight. His first comeback fight is against Steve Zuski. George waddles into the ring, visibly overweight. The crowd murmurs. His opponent looks confused, like this must be some kind of joke. It is not a joke. George knocks him out. The story spreads overnight. Big George Foreman is back, and he's knocking people out at an age when most boxers have been retired for a decade. After an unbelievable streak of 24 wins, 42-year-old George Foreman earns a shot at the reigning heavyweight champion, Evander Holyfield. It's billed as the Battle of the Ages. George fights harder than anyone expected, but he loses by unanimous decision. He visits his bank the next day. Every employee gives him a standing ovation, and HBO sends him a check for $12 million. But George tells Mary the job isn't done. He heard God tell him something in that ring, and he intends to see it through. 3 years later, Michael Moorer has dethroned Holyfield and now holds the title. George Foreman, 45 years old, is somehow back in contention. Nobody on the planet believes he can win. Moorer is 26 years old, 30 knockouts, undefeated, the first Southpaw heavyweight champion in history. Analysts don't even bother with realistic predictions. They just wait for it to be over. For 9 rounds, Moorer makes them look right. He dominates. He controls the fight. George's corner considers throwing in the towel after the 9th round. Then the 10th round happens. George lands a right hand that seems to come from a completely different era, from 1974, from 1968, from a time when he was the most feared puncher on earth. Moorer goes down. The referee counts. Moorer does not get up. The arena erupts. George Foreman, at 45 years old, has just become the oldest heavyweight champion in the history of boxing. He looks up at the ceiling, closes his eyes, and whispers something that belongs to him and God alone. The movie closes with a series of revelations that land like aftershocks. George and Muhammad Ali became the closest of friends, talking on the phone almost every single day for the rest of Ali's life. Doc Broadus was inducted into the World Boxing Hall of Fame in 1998. And George Foreman? He still preaches at his church in Houston. He still runs the youth center that almost destroyed him financially. The work is still going. Here's what makes this story different from every other underdog sports story you've ever seen. George Foreman didn't just win a championship. He lost everything: his title, his money, his marriage, his pride, rebuilt himself from nothing, and then won the championship again 2 decades later just to fund a youth gym for kids who reminded him of himself at 14. He was the hungry boy who ate his sister's food. He was the teenager who covered himself in sewage to survive. He was the man who knocked out Frazier, got destroyed by Ali, found God in a locker room, went broke, and then climbed back to the top of the world at an age when most men are thinking about retirement. Big George Foreman is one of the greatest comeback stories in human history, and this movie does it justice. Now here's where I need something from you. If you watch this entire recap, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss another breakdown like this one. And drop a comment below. I want to know, which moment in George Foreman's story hit you the hardest? Was it the childhood poverty? The loss to Ali? The comeback at 45? Tell me down below. I read every single comment. Big George Foreman, one of a kind. And this channel? We only cover stories worth your time. See you in the next one.